Welcome everyone, my name is Vince Hammond. I'm your presenter for this next session called Customizing DraftSight and an Introduction to Lisp Programming. Hopefully you're having a great conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm honored to be able to present this subject to you virtually. So the goal of this presentation is to really get you to think about opportunities you might have to streamline some of your daily tasks or daily activities and just to become a little bit more productive. For those of you that have never done any programming or customization, hopefully you'll see that it's quite easy to do and maybe you'll be intrigued to start going down that path. And for those of you that have been experts or been doing this for quite some time, hopefully I can show you a couple little tips or tricks or things that you might not have thought of to make your customization easier and or more productive. A little bit about me. Actually, I've been doing this for quite some time, a couple decades or more. But if you look at my bio, probably don't have enough time to cover all this stuff. But the one thing I think that's probably most important for this presentation is the fact that I've written a lot of Lisp code. I think I probably stopped counting a couple 100,000 lines ago. But I've been doing this for quite some time, and I've been doing this in a number of different CAD systems. And so, as you can see, I've also got some background in sales and marketing. But for the most part, we're going to just focus on custom programming and things that we can do with DraftSight for this session. First, we're going to cover some of the typical areas that you might want to go into customization for DraftSight. And then we'll go into a brief view of how you can set up some things in the custom user interface or the CUI in terms of menus and toolbars. I'll go into some custom menu commands and how those things work. And then we'll talk about API macros or the menu macros, we'll call them. And then that will sort of spill over into how we can produce those same things as Lisp code. And then I'll do a brief introduction to Lisp, and throughout this session I'll show you some different examples. At the end I'll show you a couple best practices and some more examples. So to get started, I see three main areas where there are opportunities for customization. The first would be setting standards, whether it's your system variables, creating your standard layers, or just setting up drawings. The second would be areas of repetitive tasks. Maybe you have certain things, certain blocks that get inserted over and over again, or there's a certain command that you use that is stringing different commands together, or maybe it's cleaning, migrating, or repairing drawings that you're getting from certain clients. And the last is sort of process automation. So that might be setting up drawings that are more advanced in terms of putting more of the information together based on a couple of different variables, or it is data extraction, creating bills of materials, schedules, linking databases, doing things that take a little bit more in terms of a process. So where do you start? Probably the easiest place to get going with customization is just to go into the Customize tool and start manipulating your menus and your toolbars. Probably the most efficient way of taking those most used commands and placing them in a toolbar so you have easy access to them. And once you launch the Customize tool, you'll notice that you'll have an area on the left panel where you can identify your commands, and then you can add new commands and then build those and then place them into the toolbars or into your menu. So why don't we jump over to DraftSight and let me show you how that works. So here I am in DraftSight. Now I can type in CUI, or if I go up into any menu area, I can right click and you'll notice the custom interface option that I have. And so there's two components that we look at. First of all, we look at commands, and if I scroll through here, just about every single command that DraftSight is listed inside of this interface. Now if I pick on this little extended panel over here, you'll see that all the icons, all the images of the tools that we have are available. So I can take any commands and put them into my custom toolbars. Now down here, you'll see I have a custom toolbar. And if I go down to, we'll go to interface, I go to toolbars, and I'll scroll down to my Vince toolbar. So you can create your own toolbars, and I've got one called Vince. Now I'm going to grab a command that I'm going to use often. I'm going to scroll down here. In fact, I could type options because that's what I want. I just type OPT and there's options. Simply drag this in here as a button, place it in my toolbar, apply that, and you'll notice that my toolbar will be updated, and I will now have an options button in my toolbar. Very easy. Now, since I'm going to be going into options often, I can now have that button available to me to pick and launch into that. So let's talk about what can we do with the commands and what kind of commands can we create. So what are the options we have with menu commands? Well, once we get into that customize interface tool, we have the ability to not only pick from the existing commands, but we can create our own. In fact, if you look down in the command string area, there I can type in any standard command. I can also put in what's called a menu macro, which is a string of standard commands at the command line, but I can string them together. Or I could actually put LISP code into that command string area. So let's look at a couple examples. The first one is, if you noticed, when I open the drawing, you'll see that little UCS icon in the bottom of the screen. Now, sometimes if I'm in 3D, I like that, but if I'm not in 3D, in 2D, it tends to get in my way, and I like to turn it off. So I like to create a button that simply turns that on and off. And so the sequence to do that, if you look at the screen here, is ~C, UCS icon off, or UCS icon, semicolon, off, semicolon. Now, what does that all mean? Well, the ~C, or Control-C, it's a ~C, it's the actual Shift-6 on the keyboard, is the same as typing cancel, but typing it twice. Now, why would we want to type it twice? Well, actually, there's a couple areas in DraftSight where we can get into what's called a different mode. For instance, if I'm in dimensions, I can actually go into a dimension mode, and the only way I can get back to the command line to get a clean, fresh start is to hit cancel or escape twice on the keyboard. And so we do a double cancel to make sure that if we're any kind of mode, we're getting out of whatever that command is to the command line to do a fresh command. So then we type the command, and you'll notice I can use a semicolon, which is the same as an enter. We could use a space, which is also the same as an enter, but my personal preference is to use a semicolon, because if I'm using a space, it's difficult to tell if I have one or two spaces in that macro. Now, if we, the second one I have here is if I want to turn the UCS icon back on, simply UCS icon, semicolon, on, semicolon. Now, if we put an asterisk in front of the sequence, it will repeat the sequence continually until we hit the escape key. So a good example of that is if I want to go in and create fillets of a radius of 0, I can keep that fillet radius 0 repeating over and over and over again by putting an asterisk in front of that Control-C, Control-C characters. So the other items, if you notice in this list, is there's a quote for transparent. Transparent command is a command that could be nested. For instance, zoom, pan, maybe you're orbiting, things that you would do inside of another command. You can do transparently, so we use a quote for that. There's a backslash for pause, which means if I need to pick a point, I can pause so the user can pick, and then I can continue on with the sequence. If I'm doing something where I'm moving or rotating, sometimes I need to do that from a last point selected, and so we can use the @ for the last point selected. And then there's a little trick. If we need to select objects to do something, because we don't know how many objects we need to pick or how many pauses we would need to put in there, we can use a command called select, which will allow us to grab items, and then once we're done selecting, it's a single pause for that select to move forward. And I'll give you an example of that here. But let's look at a couple others. For instance, let's say I want to combine some commands together. For instance, I want to combine the layer command with the text command. I want to be able to place a piece of text on a layer that I know is going to be a certain layer. So if you look at the sequence, what it looks like is we're going to do ~C. We're going to use the minus layer command so that we don't get the interface or the dialog box. So minus layer means we're going to be able to put the options on the command line. We're going to hit enter. We're going to say M for make layer, enter. We're going to type in the name of the layer that we want, text-1, enter. The next option would be color, C for color. We're going to make it red, which is color 1, enter. And then if you're typing the command on the keyboard, you'll notice that the next thing that comes up is, once you type in color, it's going to ask you what layer do you want to associate that color to. You can hit enter. I believe the default would be text 1, but I like to put it in there as just to be redundant or to make sure it works, and hit enter. And then after that, you'll notice there's an M text. And so my next command that goes into is right into the M text command. Now let's take a look at a macro that's a little bit more advanced. In this case, I'm going to string a number of commands together, and this is very powerful actually if you consider what is going on here. But let's break this down. So first of all, you'll notice I'm going to do a repeat. So this whole macro is going to be repeated. I'm going to use the select command like I told you earlier. We can use select, enter, and then a single backslash for pause to pick as many objects as we want. And then after that, we're going to do a copy, return. When it says what are the objects we want to copy, we use a P for previous. And then once we've done that, we hit enter. It's going to ask us for if we want any more objects. And so again, we have to hit enter twice. Then we're going to pick a 0, 0, 0 to copy the objects. And then we're going to move the previous. So we're going to make a copy of the objects, and then we're going to move the previously selected objects away, doing return, return. And then we're going to ask for 2 points, a start point and an end point for the move. And then we'll go into rotate, previous objects, hit return, return, just like we did before, having to do the selection. And then the rotation point is going to be at the last point we selected during the move command. So we're using that at, and then we hit enter. And we will do then we need to pause to put in the rotation angle for that final rotation. So basically we have a copy rotate command that's been put together into a single string, into a single macro. Very interesting, because if you were to have to try to create this as a .NET application or in some other language, it would take you quite a bit of code to make this happen, and here we can do this all in a single line macro. So let's take a look at how that works. So here we are on DraftSight, and I want to show you those commands that I created and a couple things when we look at the interface for the command. So one of the little tricks I use is whenever I create my own command, you'll notice I'm putting an exclamation point in front of it. And the reason I do that is so it shows up at the top of the list. So I know all my custom stuff is going to be at the top of the list. Otherwise, if I use the names like switch and block and nudge and UCS, they would all be down and I have to search for them. And while you can do this quick search right in here where it says find, I still like to have all my custom stuff at the very top of the list. So just one little trick that I use. Now here is that sequence, UCS icon off. I picked one of the icons. I just picked a red X and I've got a UCS icon on, and I placed them in my toolbar down here. And then there's that copy rotate, that sequence that I showed you earlier that we just described is also in here. And I dragged in something that looks like this symbol here into my toolbar. So how do those work? Just to quickly show those sequences and those macros and how they work. Let's go into a different drawing. In fact, I'll go in here, and here's my UCS icon on and off. So really simple. They're there. I use them all the time. And then let's use this copy rotate. Now, if I go in, it says specify entities. I'm just going to select some objects. Let's just take these two here. Hit enter. I'm going to pick a point, pick another point for my move. And notice I go right into the rotate command. And I can do this again. So pick a point, go over here, I pick more objects. But basically, it's repeating that loop of copy rotate all in one thing. So sometimes, for instance, if you're placing certain types of blocks, furniture, different things, you want to move things around, really useful command for just doing that sequence by 1 or 2 picks. So it makes it really, really nice. Also, I showed you that fill at 0. Now that I've got these in here, if I use this fill at 0, I think I should be able to pick 2 points from here to here. And it keeps me in the command from here to here. Oops, got to pick it twice. But it keeps repeating the loop in terms of the fill command. And until I hit escape or cancel, it's going to keep me in that command, keep that command going. All right, so let's talk about a couple more examples of macros. In this case, I showed you before where we could use the quote for transparent. So we would do a transparent zoom. Oftentimes I like to zoom extents and then zoom back just a little bit in case there's things right at the edge. So I use this sequence, zoom, return, E for extents, zoom, and then 0.9x. Also, I can use the quote for setting object snaps. For instance, entity snap mode, my preference is 119 because it's a certain sequence, and that is a certain selection of end, center, mid, I think insertion points, and also quadrants and centers. But that sequence, however you set your entity snap mode, if you've got a preference for that, that's easy to put into a button that you could then pick that button while you're in the middle of a command in case your object snaps get turned off or if they get set to something else. Now, some folks using other CAD systems know this as OS mode. In DraftSight, it's set E snap mode. It's kind of this whole command together, but either one of these will work in the sequence or in the tool. So good to know. Also, sometimes I like a command, I call it nudge, where I want to move something over 5 units over to the left or to the right. And so here we have this repeat sequence where we can select something, grab the objects, and then we can move them over 5 units. So every time we pick on them, they could simply move over by using a positive or a negative value here. But sometimes that's kind of a neat sequence to use. And then if I have, let's say I have a program that's a Lisp routine that I want to load, simply all we have to do is _C, open parenthesis, load the name of the Lisp routine, close quote, and close parenthesis, and we can load that Lisp routine. So let's talk about the difference between a macro and having a Lisp routine and what those differences are. So you saw this command string. It's the copy rotate, kind of cool. What would that look like if we wrote it as a Lisp routine? Well, as a Lisp routine, it's very similar. We're going to use an open parenthesis. We're going to use a command. It's actually called command. We're then going to put the commands that we need in quote marks inside of that Lisp routine. So it's command. The command is called select. And instead of using a backslash, here in Lisp, we use the word pause. And then we can use basically copy, P for previous, 2 close quotes for hitting the space bar. We have 00, we have remove previous, hitting it again, pause, pause, rotate. So does not look much different. It's very similar. But the difference is once I've created this as a single line Lisp routine, I could create it as a, let's call it like an alias. I wanted to create something so if I type CR at the keyboard, then I now have a copy rotate as a command. So all we have to do is if we have a startup.lisp file and we place this Lisp function in that file, as soon as we open a new drawing, it would be available. And so how this works is we start with an open parenthesis. We define the function. It's a command function called CR. We have no variables to declare, so it just open and close parenthesis. And then there's that sequence. And then I do this little cleanup at the end, print C, I do a new line, /n for new line, and say done, so it looks nice and clean when you're done with the command. So what are the differences between doing a menu command or a Lisp routine? Well, they're very similar in terms of the way the ones that I created behave. But when you get into menu commands, you have a lot of limitations. For instance, we can pause for user input, but we cannot pause and grab information, grab data, grab integers, and set them to variables. We don't have the ability to do that. Also, we're very limited in terms of how long we can get with that command string. With Lisp, we are unlimited. We can go literally thousands and thousands of lines of Lisp code that we can continually pile on command after command, where the menu macro is only it's limited to the number of characters that we can put into that specific field. Again, we can't do calculations with a menu command. It's just a sequence of events, where in Lisp we can do unlimited calculations. In the menu command, we really can't prompt the user with a dialog box to ask for questions, where in Lisp, I can design a dialog box, I can ask questions, I can get different values or display values. We don't have the ability to air trap. A menu command is sequential. It has to start and end. It can't deviate from that path. Or in Lisp, I can get values, I can change course, I can ask for different types of options and or create error traps. And there again, like I said, there's no conditional behaviors that we can do in a menu macro, where in Lisp we can do if, then, while, for, each, whatever. And so let's talk a little bit more about Lisp and what that means to you in terms of what you can do. Now, the thing I'd like to think about Lisp is it's actually very easy. And the reason it's easy, there's a couple of reasons, but it's for those of you that haven't really written any programming languages before, or haven't written in Visual C++ or C# or Visual Basic or .NET. If you've done none of that type of programming, then this might be an easy language for you to learn because you don't have to do a lot of the things that you have to do in those other languages. However, if you're used to using those other languages, you may not want to go into Lisp other than doing some of the short macro things that I've been showing you. So the cool thing about Lisp is that if I write a Lisp routine, it will work in almost any of the other DWG editors that are out there. There's plenty of them out there, but almost all of them support Lisp. And those Lisp routines that you write in other programs will also work in DraftSight and vice versa if you do them correctly. Also, Lisp is platform independent. It doesn't care what version of Windows you're on or what if you're in Windows or not. It will work in different platforms. You do not have to compile your code. So I can basically take that text file that I wrote, my startup.lisp file as a text file, and I can run it without compiling it, without doing anything special to it. I can just run it as it is. Because I don't have to compile it and because it's just text, these Lisp routines are very lightweight. They're very small. There is no limit to the length of a Lisp routine that you can create or how deep you can go with your logic. I have written Lisp routines that are 30, 40,000 lines of code with literally thousands of levels of different types of logic for if, then, do this, if not, do that. There's just really no limit to how far you can go. And so very powerful when it comes to the ability to not only have it do different things, but also opening up files that are extremely large and being able to process those as well. Now, I prefer to use Notepad++. It's a free editor. It works really well. But you've got multiple options for editors. You can use Notepad if you want. Also, any of those other editors that are out there, they just have to be able to cleanly edit the Lisp routine file and keep it as strictly ASCII code. I'll show you what I mean by that here in a minute. Also, with Lisp, I can manipulate things inside of a drawing, and also I can manipulate data outside of the drawing. I'm not just limited to working inside of the drawing. And to be honest, if you have questions about writing Lisp routines and you want to write something for DraftSight, because other drawing editors are basically the same, if you go online and use research or Google search for, I want to be able to do this inside of DraftSight, chances are you'll find a reply and it'll probably work even though it was written for some other CAD platform. It's very powerful, very easy to use and it can also get very complicated if you want. But for the most part, I'd like to think it's easy language because you don't have to think about a lot of the things that you have to consider in other programming languages. So if you're a beginner and you're just getting started, what are things that you might want to use Lisp to do? So like I showed you the shortcut for copy rotate, you could create your own shortcuts, basically better versions of aliases. For instance, fillet radius is a great example. If I want to write a Lisp routine to control a fillet radius, it's simply open parenthesis command, and we use the fillet command. We set the radius, and then after we've set the radius, you'll notice we have to enter the fillet command again to get back into making fillets. So the proper way to do it, if you notice, is putting the command in there twice. But simple to do, very easy, and that's a one-line Lisp routine. The other thing you might consider is looking at if you have system variables or drawing variables, things that you're trying to set up. I like to have my entity snaps set automatically. In this case, I have a certain setting, and I'll set it up with a certain mode. 119 is my preference. I think that's the one that I see on the screen there. Also, another use is creating standard layers. Oftentimes, you'll need to create layers. You'll get drawings that don't have layers, so it's a really good, easy thing to do to just write a Lisp routine to create those layers. Or let's say I want to bring in a title block and put attributes in the title block and put that in a certain location and put it on a certain layer. A small Lisp routine would be able to automate that process, so I'm not having to go do all the picks that I would have to do to place that title block every time I create a drawing. And oftentimes we see companies looking at, if I'm converting a drawing to my company standards, I'm getting a drawing from a client and I need to grab a bunch of information on certain layers and move it to another layer. A great example of writing a Lisp routine to do a sequence of events like that. So let's look at a couple examples. In fact, here's the one we talked about before. The command is fillet, and I'm going to create a function called fh, fillet, half millimeter. And I will say fh, and the command will be fillet radius 0.5 fillet. And then we use this little parenthesis at the end to just clean up the code so it doesn't say the word nil at the end. But that's it. It's a one-line Lisp routine. You can put this in your startup.lisp, and you'll have the command fh to be able to create half millimeter fillets. So what if I want to create some more? Well, very simple, F0, F1, F2, and I'm just changing the values, and there I have a whole series of fillet functions that I can put into my startup that would be available to me automatically. Now, what's that look like? I can use Notepad, and it's startup.lisp. It looks simply like this. If I use a semicolon, that's just a comment line, and there it is. It's sitting in startup.lisp. If I put the startup.lisp Notepad file in any of my support directories, it will automatically load up when I start a drawing. Very convenient. So these would be automatically available to me because they're in my startup. Now, I talked about Notepad++. The difference between using Notepad or Notepad++, like I said, it's a free editor. It gives me the ability to color code. And so here I noticed, my commands are in blue, my text, my strings are in orange, my numerical values are in red, and so on. And what's nice about this is if I make a typo or I type something incorrectly or I forget a quote mark, then what you'll notice is the color coding is an easy indicator that I did something or I typed something wrong. Oh, by the way, I did want to mention this. Early on, I kept calling the apostrophe a quote. And that's probably because I've been doing a bit of programming lately. And if you use an apostrophe in the editor, it actually acts the same as putting the text in quote marks. And so in programming language, it can still be a quote, but I know you probably got confused because I kept calling it a quote when it is apostrophe, so I apologize for that. But it's just kind of me forgetting that I was more looking at it as an apostrophe rather than looking at it as quotes. So again, just to keep that in mind, that inside of a Notepad++ editor, I can use the apostrophe the same as a double quote around the text string. All right, so let's look at another example. I talked about making layers earlier, and so if you look at this example, simply I'm making a Notepad file, text file called makelayers.lsp, and I then put in my command, which is -layer. We use minus so it doesn't bring up the dialog box. We're going to make a layer. The layer is going to be layer 1. The color is going to be 1. And then if you recall, whenever we make a layer in the CAD program, it's going to ask us for the name of the layer that we're going to assign the color to. or whenever we change the color, we have to assign the layer. So this is the sequence. So here I can put in all my layers that I want, and by the pick of a button or by typing in make layers, I would have this available to me inside of DraftSight. So let's talk about some best practices. So the first thing is we do have to use we cannot use a word editor. We have to use an editor that does not put in formatting characters. So we're talking about those quote marks. For an example, if you look at the way this appears on the screen, you'll notice that in PowerPoint, I have this right and left quote marks because it looks nice, but the reality is that those characters will not work inside of the Lisp routine because they're not considered strings. And so you have to use an editor. You cannot use Word or WordPad. You really need to use something that is like a Notepad or Notepad++ type of an editor. Also, whenever I write a Lisp routine, oftentimes I will test the sequence of commands that I'm going to create manually, typing them in. A great example is, let's say I want to automate plotting to a PDF file. Well, notice here I'm going to start with an open parenthesis, the name command, and I'm going to use the plot command. And the first question will say, do you want to do advanced options? And you'll say yes. And then what's the area you want to plot? I'm going to say model. What's the driver? I'm going to use PDF, and so on. So the sequence of events that goes through, you want to document that. And I often do this manually. I go through, I test that sequence manually, and then make sure that I got all the steps down before I write my Lisp routine. What I'll do is I'll write that Lisp routine as I type it out in the command line, and then try to run that and see if it works to make sure that I'm doing it correctly before I then put it into a larger program. Also, you saw me putting the little print C in the quote or in the open and close parenthesis. If you don't do that, then you'll just sometimes you see this little word that comes up. It says nil. Nil isn't an error. It's not a bad thing. It just means that it's done with the program. Hopefully you can see that it doesn't take a lot to create simple Lisp routines. They can be just a couple lines of code. They don't have to be very complicated, and they can do very powerful things. If you're interested in taking it a bit further, we've actually recorded a 7-session series of videos to help you go from beginning to end on how to create Lisp routines, and also get more in depth in terms of how to set variables, how to manipulate objects, how to grab object data, how to manipulate and work with blocks and attributes and extracting attribute data, and then also being able to create your own interface, DCL dialog box interface, and being able to retrieve and put information into different drawings. Before I close, I have a couple more things that I would like to show you. First of all, I do want to show you the startup.lisp as an example and how that works, and a couple of the functions that I've added to that. And then also we've had a number of requests for the ability to automatically publish PDFs of all the different layout tabs. And so I've written a Lisp routine to do this, but I wanted to show you how that works, so that if this is something that's of interest to you, it might be worth it to go through some of the training just to get hold of a program like this. All right, so if I jump over to DraftSight, the first one I wanted to show you was the Make Layers. And in fact, what I did is I did create a button in my toolbar called Make Layers. Now, if I come up to my pull down to look at the current layers, I've only got a couple layers in here, but if I come down to my Make Layers and I push that button, come back up, you'll notice all those layers that were in that Lisp routine automatically got created. So very simple, but that's one of those things where if you have a standard where you have a bunch of layers set up the way you like them, just by having a one-click button to put those layers in the drawing is oftentimes very valuable. So let's bounce over to Notepad++ and let me show you the current startup that I have. So for instance, you'll notice the semicolons are the comment line, so that doesn't do anything. I'm setting a variable here for my current version, so when I load a drawing, it tells me what my current version of my settings are, or my standards are. And then here's that copy rotate. Again, it's a single line. If I highlight the beginning of this, you'll see that the last parenthesis, the closed parenthesis gets highlighted. Now, you could break this up into multi-lines, but since it's such a simple Lisp routine, I like to just keep it on one line. Here are my fillets, my F0, F1, F2. There they are. Here's my M layers. It loads my make layers. It's a defined function. Then I'm going to come down just a little bit, and I'm going to show you. I created a function called QPDF. So let's say I just wanted to take and make a quick PDF of the model view that I'm looking at in a certain size, in a certain format, and I just want to do that very quickly. Well, here's the whole Lisp routine to do. It's 3 lines of code technically. I'm setting a variable, I'm taking the drawing prefix, the drawing name, and I'm putting them together with a dash model PDF, and then I'm just going to, if I type in QPDF, I'm just going to plot out to the PDF file automatically. So just sort of an example, but the reason I'm showing you this is because this is part of that other sequence that I talked about. Let's go back to DraftSight. The drawing I wanted to show you is this pump drawing. Now, you'll notice that I've got a couple different layout tabs. I got an ISO view, full view. If I bounce over there, you'll see. Now, if you look at this drawing is not correct. It needs to be updated. So if I zoom in here, and let's just go ahead and move this this line so it lines up better, looks a little better. And notice that I made a change. If I go to save my drawing, when I go to save, what you'll notice is happening is it's going to ask me if I want to publish all my layouts to PDFs. And if I say yes, in a couple seconds, you'll notice it's done. It created all my PDFs. And so if I go ahead and grab my ISO view of my PDF, you'll notice, double clicking on it, it should be repaired. But it made that ISO view automatically just by saving the drawing. Something that we've heard requests for, but really not very complicated. If we look at the program to do that, this is the entire program. It's less than 30 lines of code, and that one line of plotting to a PDF file in a certain format is part of that program. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's really not a lot of code to make that happen in an automated fashion. So just another example of something I'd like to show in terms of what you can do with just a few lines of Lisp code and a little bit of training. All right, well, I believe that wraps up this presentation, and I really appreciate you attending my session. Hopefully I was able to give you some ideas on things that you can do with just either simple customization, menu macros, or perhaps maybe I've intrigued you enough to think about some simple Lisp routines, or even looking at doing some things that are more complicated. Be sure to look out for that 7 video series training from start to finish on Lisp, and also be sure to be active on the forums, because I know there's a lot of people up there that have been posting some really interesting things about Lisp inside of DraftSight. So hopefully you have a great rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.